invited to look at a number of locations, were you, for this, to come up with your piece for Art Sheffield?
Yeah, it started with a tour of various spaces, some sort of derelict, some old factories, some that had been kind of derelict warehouses turned into studios or galleries and things. So this was probably like the most derelict of all of them.
And it appealed to you?
I really like derelicts. I mean, I grew up around derelict factories and things, so I mean, I think people have a kind of fascination with dereliction. I do. I mean, I think whenever you go around an old castle and it's falling to bits, it's kind of nicer than when it's been sort of regenerated sometimes.
Absolutely.
I didn't know what I was going to do in it at the point I chose to use it, but yeah, it was kind of the most interesting, I think, of the whole set.
So would you mind explaining, what you came up with, what the installation's about?
I got in the space and had a look, and I was really confused about what to do, and thought about it for weeks and weeks and weeks. What am I going to do? And normally I kind of have it kind of comes together quite easily. It's like, I can put some this here, and I was really struggling with this piece of work. And then one day I was having breakfast, I had a friend round, and we were listening to an old radio broadcast from pirate radio station that someone had uploaded to the internet from 1992. And 1992 is kind of an important year for me because of what was going on in music and music technology and how the changes in each sort of correlated with one another. And so I was listening to this mix, and it seemed like a lot of the things that I thought were happening at that time, for example, how music sort of fragmented into, the club music fragmented into sort of like hardcore, progressive house, jungle, techno, all these subgenres started to emerge. And I kind of heard that all in this mix, this kind of moment at which this scene was splitting off into lots of sub-scenes. So I emailed Richard, I got his email address off someone and told him about it and that I would like to use it in Park Hill. And then he said, well, actually it was broadcast in Park Hill from a derelict flat in Park Hill. So then it was like, okay, this is a really perfect thing to do. And the whole work sort of evolved around that, really, and I started building kind of contextual materials and researching the political and social sort of events at the time.
Right, and as you researched it, you kind of became more and more convinced that this was a pivotal time in
I kind of already, my practice already kind of focuses on that moment anyway. A lot of the work I do sort of looks at what happened then, if you see what I mean. So the kind of records that I produce sort of deal with what was happening around 88, 89-ish, and like, for example, how the sound of a kick drum changed. Like in 1987, for example, it was like a kind of hard, clicky type sound, like the early 80s sort of kick drum paradigm.
Yeah.
And by the later 80s, it had become this deeper kind of thuddier thing.
Yeah.
So for me, just that cultural shift in what a kick drum should sound like is quite an interesting moment. The early house records, for example, had this very sharp kind of kick drum.
Yeah.
Then, like a year or so later, it was like this deep, which we have until the present day.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, that time's always been a bit of a fascination for me.
But what did you feel were the political and social kind of undercurrents that were tapping in? Maybe being reflected by what was happening in music? Well,
prior to that, you'd had the miners' strike, things like the Battle of the Beanfield at Stonehenge. And I was sort of at that time in that alternative world of politics and anarchism and things. Then, like around 88, you have Clause 28, which is when the government tried to prevent local councils promoting homosexuality to kids, which is quite a sick thing to do, I think.
Yeah.
Then, soon after that, poll tax riots. You had the censoring of Sinn Féin politicians on British television. They actually removed The Voice.
That's right.
Slightly after that was the Gulf War, and we were involved in that. Around that time too, Tony Blair first started to question the idea of Clause 4 of the Labour Party manifesto, which is a commitment to collective ownership.
Yeah.
So it was a moment of quite massive political change and also kind of social repression. The government, like one of the pieces is this Peter Lilley speech where he's targeting New Age travellers, calling people locusts, which you wouldn't do today. I mean, they still use that kind of language, but it's much more sophisticated and this was just like brutal hatred, basically. Targeting single parents, saying they were getting pregnant to just get houses and things like that. So basically, they were picking on everyone that was part of my friendship group,
Yeah.
So.
And it hit Sheffield particularly hard, though, didn't it? All of that.
Yeah, I guess. I mean.
The steel industry was on its knees.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess it had already, like my dad was a steel worker and he was already unemployed by then. But for me, it wasn't a bad time. It was actually a great time because there were all these empty spaces and there were the resources there to do things like make music and have parties and just take part in something that was an alternative to that.
Crises do seem to have a triggering effect for kind of human
I think
responses that can be quite joyful and quite sort of positive.
Yeah, I think it was like people just came together. People just had enough of it. And like a recurrent theme of this exhibition is this song by Rosala from 1992, which is quite a commercial, cheesy, sort of trashy thing. Everybody's free to feel good. And it was like, it really summed up for me this kind of wanting to feel okay about stuff, and in the face of this massive repression from the government.
Yeah.
And,
but what you created here is something quite disturbing, isn't
is
it?
It? Well, maybe it is. It's meant to represent the unease of the time, but also the optimism of the time. Like I had a friend who I used to hang around with then, he came and had a look yesterday and started looking at the light boxes with things and said he nearly started crying because it was quite emotional just to remember just how intense that time was. And yeah.
But this is a pub that you would never have dared to come to.
I never went to pubs because every time I went to a pub I just get beat up. I didn't drink much, and although I was part of this party community, I never took drugs. I wasn't a drug user. So throughout it all, I was always a bit of an observer, if you know what I mean. I was like the guy who was just looking at things and not really going mental and losing the plot.
Yeah.
So yeah, pubs for me were an alien space. It was full of behaviours that I didn't like,
Yeah.
Like I don't like homophobia or sexism or racism, and then it was sort of like it was kind of a little bit acceptable to be like that.
Oh yeah.
In these situations, so.
Yeah. And this dry ice you've got here would have been cigarettes.
Yeah, and I never even smoked a cigarette once in my entire life, so It was like, I just didn't like those spaces. And I was stupid enough that if someone said anything that I objected to, I'd usually say, what are you talking about? And then I'd just get beat up, so pubs weren't nice spaces. And this was an especially dangerous one.
Yeah, the second most dangerous in Britain, I believe.
Apparently, yeah. I don't know how they kind of quantified levels of danger in pubs, but... No. But yeah, I'm sure it was quite dangerous.
And you said in the past that your music is sort of, you're not really trying to engage people emotionally with music. You're sort of trying to provoke them and make them ask questions. Obviously there's a lot of questions to be asked around this. What kind of questions do you hope people might take away?
Well, one thing I didn't want to do was kind of construct a history of that time, like an official story of this is what happened, or kind of memorabiliarise it. So there's no kind of objects that are directly related to that scene.
That would evoke a sort of cosy nostalgia sort of thing. Yeah.
So like there's a kind of timeline, and for a long time I was researching what to put on this timeline of social, political events, musical events, etc. And I decided to present it as a bunch of sticky notes.
Yeah.
So it kind of reinforces the idea that this information is still in flux, sort of, and can be moved around or added to or removed.
And you put some post-it notes on
so people can add stuff, So it's this idea of not trying to construct a single history or something. So for me, what I'm trying to do is present in a kind of quite ambiguous way is the correspondences between changes in the musical vocabularies and musical technologies and political situations, and how these things somehow correspond with one another. So what I want to happen is that people think about that.
And do you feel that music still has that edge and that power to be political and to engage people who feel otherwise disenfranchised? Or do you feel that art has sort of taken over that territory?
I think the kind of powers that be are quite clever at using the language around. Like, for example, one of the things on there is about Tesco's and how Tesco's use this rhetoric of community space, etc. So I think
and they've started selling vinyl, haven't they? Just to show they're down with the hipsters.
Which means that the independent producers can't actually get access to lathes, so there's and pressing plants. So there's now there's a massive. The people who kind of kept those factories open now don't have access to them because Sainsbury's are repressing whatever. Do you know what I mean? In massive quantities. So yeah, I think things have got more sophisticated, you know, and I think there's always a kind of constant struggle between trying to have a society that is about social justice and the way that is kind of constantly being eroded. And I think that the process that takes gets kind of a bit more subtle and you know, the Conservative Party now are a lot more sophisticated in the choice of words, etc., than they were then. But you know, we've not really come a long way. If you look at the kind of discussions now about migrants, etc., it's not. I mean, essentially, it's the same sentiment that they were having in the Peter Lilley speech. So.
But as a musician and an artist, do you feel that you have, you know, the arts gives you more space to kind of publicise your views or provoke or interrogate what's happening than perhaps the music does?
Not necessarily. I mean, they function differently. The audiences are different. The kind of structures around it are different. The kind of preconceptions embedded in those traditions are quite different. So, for example, in music, it's all about emotion and joy, etc., or whatever. And in the art world, it's all about being critical or analytical. So, to make a record that's analytical is quite a challenging thing to that kind of the rhetoric around it, and also to make an artwork that doesn't attempt to be kind of critical. Like for a long time, a lot of my work was entirely formalist, if you know what I mean. There was no kind of attempt to look or sound like I was dealing with any issues other than the formal issues in the work themselves. And that was a kind of reaction against the art establishment always wanting to have this kind. What's the meaning of this work? Or you know, I studied art, and the whole 3 years it was like, well, what does this art mean? Yeah. And you know, I found that kind of quite not a very nice situation to be in, if you know what I mean.
But you've come back from that position.
Well, now I'm kind of trying to. 2 years ago, I made a film with this guy Luke Fowler, who's a filmmaker. He made a piece about R.D. Laing, and we were commissioned to make a film about a feminist photographic collective in the north of England in the 1980s. So from this kind of world of, you know, entirely formalist sort of work or superficially formalist kind of interest, I was suddenly working on this project that was like dealing with a lot of difficult issues, and on top of that it was two guys making this piece of work about the history of feminist photography. So meeting the women that were kind of involved in that scene and just reflecting on it sort of just shifted my practice a little bit, I think, and gave me more of an interest in directly kind of addressing the kind of political things that were relevant to me. Yeah. If you see what I mean.
As a human being.
Yeah.
I suppose last question.
These are quite
reflecting
hard questions.
reflecting on Sheffield now and how it's changed. Obviously, you're still very much based in the area.
Yeah.
Is there still a very vibrant music scene? Is there as much inventiveness and creativity and rebellion?
It's hard to say what counts as creativity. I think there's inventiveness everywhere. I like in my music, for example, people often call it experimental. And I don't like that word because for me all music is sort of experimental. Like Motown, for example, is really experimental. So I'd find it difficult to say, there was this level of creativity at one point and a different level now. You know, there's still a lot of good music being made and a lot of good scenes and things happening. But most of my exposure to music takes place outside Britain at European festivals, so
Right.
I'm not really part of any sort of local scene anymore.
I suppose there was that sense I was kind of immersing myself in there's some wonderful John Peel sessions on YouTube. I was kind of immersing myself in those, so Cabaret Voltaire and Human League.
Yeah.
And just thinking, wow, there really was an amazing kind of emergence of talent from Sheffield over a sort of 2-decade period, 70s, 80s.
I mean, I think there was from like also Leeds, Newcastle, Manchester, Liverpool as well.
And you don't get the feeling that happens so much now, that there are these nexuses of really interesting musicians kind of inspiring and cross-fertilising each other and then emerging into the mainstream.
Also, to be interested in music at that time was a bit like a full-time job, because you had to really work hard to find out what was happening and go to record fairs and shows and things. And these days it's all instantly available.
Yeah, but radio shows had a phenomenal role, didn't they? I mean, John Peel and Pirate Radio.
Yeah.
If you found a good one, that's where you would go. That's where that would be your source.
And actually, like, it was my kind of professional career sort of kicked off after having a show on a pirate radio station,
right,
where I kind of used to make all the music that I'd play that night, and then it was like, oh, someone wanted to release it, and so radio's a really creative medium, I think.
But with the presence of this pirate radio broadcast in this derelict pub, are you drawing parallels between that world where there were communities that coalesced around pubs, radio stations, it just doesn't happen like that anymore? Or is that incidental?
I think radio still exists, and there still are pirate radio stations, but they tend to be internet based, and so they don't speak to a geographically localized kind of crowd.
Yeah.
Pirate radio, by its definition, was kind of like you go a few kilometers in each direction, and so it was quite specific, and I think that probably doesn't happen now. And one of its functions was like a kind of precursor to social media, so it enabled people to say, this is what's happening tonight, I'm going here, or who was that person I met last night, can you come and so I think like Facebook and stuff have sort of taken that sort of role now.
Do you think it's a good thing?
Well, I don't use Facebook. I don't use Facebook or Twitter, so I have no idea. I don't really like Facebook, I don't know why. There's some fact that people who use it are more prone to feeling isolated and depressed than people who don't. So
figure, and they think they're connecting with
it's
their
all
friends.
about, but it's this kind of pseudo connection, and I'm kind of more. You need to be physically in the same place as someone and sort of hang out. If you know what I mean. I mean, the internet's great, but it's not a replacement for embodied contact.
Absolutely. Yeah.